All right. There are a number of false arguments about repository pattern that I get quite often as comments to my YouTube video as well as discussions. So in this video, I'm going to go over each of these arguments and explain my rationale. So hopefully by the end of watching this video, you will have a better understanding of this whole idea of the repository pattern. So the first false argument is this idea of repository over repository. So our John Smith is back, and he believes Entity Framework already implements the repository and unit of work patterns. And implementing these patterns once again in the code is unnecessary and redundant. And this is his rationale. He believes that the dbset class in Entity Framework looks like a repository because here we have methods for adding, removing, and finding objects, and we don't have a method to save objects to the database. And dbContext looks like unit of work. So it has a method called save changes, which is similar to our complete method. So yes, this is absolutely right. Entity Framework does implement some kind of repository and unit of work pattern internally. However, there are a couple of issues with the implementation of these patterns in Entity Framework. The first issue is this iQueryable interface exposed from dbContext and dbset. So here, when we go to context.vcalls, with this iQueryable interface exposed here, we can compose queries like what you see here. We can eager load objects, we can filter them, we can group them, order them, and so on. And this is exactly what we had in our actions before we introduced the repository class. So with this dbset, we end up with fat queries duplicated in different places. And this is the whole idea of using the repository pattern. We want to encapsulate these queries inside a single class. The other issue we have here is that we don't want our controller to be tightly coupled to dbContext. So if in the future we decide to replace dbContext with something else, not necessarily for the entire application, maybe just for one controller, maybe for performance reasons, maybe we just want to explore a new ORM. With dbContext being all over the place, making such changes is going to be very costly. We want our controller to be coupled to an interface, iRepository interface. And this interface is part of our application. It's not specific to any persistence frameworks. Today, we have an implementation of this interface that uses dbContext, which is part of Entity Framework. Tomorrow, we can create another implementation that uses a different approach to get or persist data. So nowhere in our controller we know about Entity Framework. We only know about the iRepository interface. We don't even know about this implementation. The only place we have referenced this concrete implementation is inside configure services method. So here we have a reference to vehicle repository. Nowhere else in the application we are referencing this implementation. Everywhere in every controller we are using iVehicle repository. If in the future we want to replace this implementation, this is the only line that we need to modify. We'll create another implementation of this interface and simply register it as a service inside this method. So back to John Smith's argument, no, we are not adding repository over repository. We are decoupling our application from Entity Framework. Plus, we're encapsulating all these fat duplicated queries inside a separate class. So earlier in our controller class, we had 3 references to dbContext to get a complete vehicle object. By this refactoring, we reduced these 3 references to only 1 reference. If you want to change how we get a complete vehicle object, there is only one place we need to change.